Well, much anticipated interview, Simon. We've been industry friends for a long time, and I've admired your work for years and years. And one thing that you've really been passionate about and pioneered is sharing the message out there with a lot of people that don't know any better, what sort of rental disaster our nation is facing, and how quickly we've come towards where we're at. And I guess, sadly, the fact that it's not going to get any better, I think it will get worse. And I know that you agree. I feel really privileged to have you spending time with me today, chatting about all kinds of things nationally, but specifically what triggered this was a state tax change. 2 days ago, the Victorian government announced that they'd be clawing back some of the costs that they spent during the COVID budget blowout, and they're targeting a few different businesses and community and I guess people like myself, investors, and I think it's not necessarily the best way to tackle it, and that's an understatement. So welcome on board, and thanks for joining me.
My pleasure, Kate. Yeah, it's a pressing issue. I mean, housing, other than water, I think it's the second most essential thing for all humans. And we go right back to 1950. For every year since 1950, 1 in 3 Australian households have rented, and that's not a disaster. That's actually a success. We have been leading the world in those last 70 years in terms of home ownership rates, but that still means that 3 in every 10 people depend on rental accommodation, Kate. And it's 92% of all of Australia's rental pool that are funded by the everyday Aussie investor. And logic sort of suggests that at a time when everybody knows we don't have enough rental accommodation, logic suggests that the only way to address this problem is to support those who are capable of providing more rental accommodation. But Dan Andrews' latest chapter in a very ugly horror movie is just yet another piece of let's punish rental suppliers and somehow thinking that's going to improve the situation. It's ridiculous, but it's the world we live in.
Yeah, the mind boggles. And, there's some parallels with this, which I'll talk about later on in this interview, with the mess that Queensland got itself into. And if anyone was close to it, they were considering land tax reforms as well. And they were quite nasty ones. They were actually impacting non-Queenslanders as well. And that was repealed because of its vast stupidity, really. And a lot of people were up in arms about it, and some of our industry buddies did a very good job of getting the truth out there. But circling back to Vic, obviously we got pretty messy during COVID. We were in lockdown for over 280 days. There was a lot of blood on the streets, a lot of businesses in distress, and a lot of spending, not necessarily good spending. I wouldn't have wanted to be Dan Andrews, but I look back at it all and wish it was handled so very differently. But if we just talk about renters and investors, and taking into account the challenges the Victorian investors went through, in particular Melburnian investors during lockdown, I mean, we were already tackling difficult rental reforms, which you've touched on off air with me, Simon. Limitations to the landlord's ability to control their own asset, all the way from not being able to prevent pets in the property to after the first 12 months of fixed lease, you can't actually tip a tenant out unless you've got a significant reason, whereas we used to have a 120-day no reason clause. So it's got those things have been difficult for landlords. Also a limitation to how often you can review the rent. And the difficult rental reforms were already biting. Things like gas and electricity checks that could trigger, tens of thousands of dollars worth of expense. I'm all for a safe place for a tenant. What I'm not all for is some of the things that can topple out of that are quite negative. So you've got service providers that are taking advantage and pricing things out ridiculously. We're all going through that. We all know what that's all about. Then we had COVID strike, and we had the rental eviction moratorium, and Dan Andrews basically, and Scott Morrison for that to that point, let Victorian landlords deal with it. They basically said, you guys sort it out, how to deal with your tenant if you have to. And a lot of people were getting no rent or some rent, but many of us weren't getting complete rent because tenants were in distress as well. And we all had to, as I said, we were all in it together and we had to make it work. And we did. Most of us did anyway. We then had an increase into our interest rates, which every person who holds a mortgage or has credit deals with. So, you know, that's a cost of doing business. But again, it's tough. We had increases to our land tax only last year, and now this COVID repair land tax. And you and I chatted about it. Is that going to economically break it for people? I think there'll be a small number of people that it could economically break it for. I've argued that cash flow investors who have tried to navigate having a cash flow neutral asset could really be hurt by this, especially if they are lower income earners that have held it together. But I think the vast majority of people who decide to sell as a result of this, it's more about just being fed up, and it's the straw on the camel's back, really.
Absolutely. People are fed up. This mess is not unique to Victoria. There is not a big city, medium-sized city, small town anywhere in Australia that hasn't been battling with this rental mess. We're now into our 8th year, Kate. It started a long, long time ago, back when Melbourne and Sydney were in their property boom. And a lot of want-to-be homeowners blame property investors for the fact that they weren't in a home themselves. And if people can recall, we had 2 federal elections, 2016 and 2019, when the number one centerpiece of both federal elections was let's scrap negative gearing. So here we are, 2023, and you and I have a conversation about Dan Andrews increasing land tax in Victoria. That's what I said earlier. This is just one more chapter in a long, long list of a enormous, the ugliest horror show for Australian real estate in 230 years of our existence since European settlement. There's never been a situation like this before. A lot of landlords have already sold up well before Dan Andrews' decision, and not just in Victoria. I mean, some numbers for people. There's a misconception because humans have an innate nature to focus on the here and now and what's right in front of them. So the commentary at the moment is that, this mess has been caused by interest rates, or it's been caused by overseas migration because that's very topical at the moment, or it was caused by COVID. It's been caused by none of that.
Yeah.
It's 8 years in the making. The current day decisions just makes the mess that's been created over the last years even more complicated. It's not caused by the overseas migration. Some Victorian numbers. Victoria's population usually grows by about 130,000 people per year. In the 2020-21 financial year, Victoria's population declined by 150,000 people. The following year it grew. So last year, it grew, but by only 70,000 people. So those 2 years combined, Victoria had minus 60,000 population in those 2 years. Normally grows by 130,000 people per year. So we should actually have an enormous housing surplus of rental accommodation, enormous surplus. So it's got nothing to do with the current commentary about overseas migration. The problem was caused a long, long time ago because every single year, even without population growth, rental demand increases. Every time you have a teenager who says, I want independence and I want to leave home, that triggers a demand for rental accommodation, but there's been no change to population growth there. Every time you have a couple have a separation, 2 homes all of a sudden now we need, 1 home now we need 2 homes. That happens every single year. So rental demand grows every year. I mentioned earlier, for the last 70 years, 3 out of 10 households have been renters. So we need to add to the rental pool each and every year. What's happened in this country is we've been actually reducing the size of the rental pool each and every year. Why? Because investing is a discretionary action. 92% of Australia's rental pool is not funded. It is not funded by the government. It's funded by the everyday Aussie property investors. They don't have to do that. So discretionary action. To do that, they need confidence. They need confidence that it's worth taking the risk. They need support, legislative support. They haven't had legislative support. No. They've had restrictions. So progressively, people who had already funded their own hard-earned money to provide rental accommodation for their fellow Australians, progressively they've sold that property. When there's an existing rental property that's sold, that displaces the tenant that was in that property, unless there's another property purchased somewhere else by a property investor. So that's created this mess. Now that we've restarted overseas migration, that just compounds the problem that was created
It does
before. So
indeed.
what should actually happen is the Dan Andrews of the world should be saying, hey, you are the people more than anyone that we need to support at the moment. Anything that humans spend money on, there's potential to create a tax for. Anything that we spend money on, right?
Yep.
So why is it that this dickhead thinks it's a good idea to tax someone who's providing rental accommodation at a time when we've never had a bigger shortage in our 230-year history? He could tax 1,000 things. He could tax beer, bread, milk, whatever that we spend money on, right? Why has he done this already after investors have had so many extra increased expenses, and their income has been significantly curtailed because of a series of policies? It's crazy, and it's impossible to know how ugly this will get, because the heads of the people who are making these decisions, clearly they have no interest in solving it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Simon, I want to myth bust a few ridiculous comments that I've seen in the media for a long time, but this week I've had it up to, up to here with some of the arguments that I've seen different groups come back with. One person dared to say to me yesterday, well, if a landlord decides to sell, well, then a tenant will just purchase. So it's a net, there's no loss. And I didn't know how to articulate just how flawed that argument is, because we've got a lot of tenants, that might not want to own for various reasons. Someone might be on contract, it might be a temporary arrangement, they might be renting while they're building, they could have had a split and they're in a partnership and they can envisage themselves rekindling and purchasing a property with someone else. They could be a student. There's a lot of reasons why tenants don't want to purchase. And then there's the tenants that would love to purchase but can't. They might have insufficient ability to service the debt. They might not be able to qualify for a loan at all because of previous credit history. They might not have a sufficient deposit. And I know that we've had state and federal governments working hard at helping with the deposit hurdle, which I think is an awesome thing, by the way. But my point is, a tenant doesn't miss out on property ownership because of an investor.
No.
And
no, never have. And again, I'll keep saying it, 70 years, the last 70 years in this country, 3 out of 10 households have been rented. People rent for a whole bunch of reasons. With home ownership becomes the single biggest financial responsibility that we could have, and that's paying back a mortgage. That's maintaining a property, that's paying the rents, paying the council rates, that's paying the insurance. There's a lot of costs that come with it. Some people are flat out living, week to week. They just don't have the financial discipline. Frankly, they don't deserve home ownership because they haven't proven to themselves and to banks and everybody else that they're good with money and will be responsible enough to pay back a mortgage. Others can't hold down a job, so they've got no chance of ever getting a loan. Others just refuse to save. They don't have the financial discipline, to acquire home ownership. There are others who enjoy being mobile. There are others who don't want to be anchored down to their own home. Maybe at some later stage in their life they might want to do that, but they're too busy traveling at the moment. Or
they could be rent investors who have invested in other asset classes as well. I mean, correct. I know plenty of households that are building a good financial future for themselves with a good share portfolio, and they've chosen to rent while they're doing that. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that someone who is renting is caught in a horrible trap. I know plenty of renters that have positive financial outlooks, and look at the abundance of students that rent, particularly in Melbourne. I just thought it was such a flawed argument. And the other argument was, well, if we lose an investor, it's a first home buyer that purchases it, and that's flawed as well, because we've got you mentioned divorce, and that did impact Melbourne quite severely during lockdowns for obvious reasons. And so we have seen a lot of divorcees, splitting from being a one household family to a two household family. How permanent that will be, I think we've had a spike in divorce activity, so that will calm down, but it's still not the vast majority of reasons why we've got a rental shortage. We've also had the Chinese government have students return to the nation that they're studying in, and we have a lot of Chinese students, so we've had an influx of students here. We do have new arrivals, there's no way around that. A lot of them, well, they're skilled migrants. A lot come out with money and purchase a home. House and land packages have slowed down because we've got limited building starts. you're right, though. The problem is exacerbated by these conditions, but it has been caused by these conditions. Another thing that I've talked about is the fact that some of these properties might be units in the city or in the inner ring. I'm seeing a lot of second homeowners purchase. And when I say second homeowners, what I mean is someone who has the country house or the seaside house. A lot of people did the tree change during lockdown. And now that they're back at work, they're looking for a pad in the city to live in part-time. So we're seeing potentially some of our rental stock being sold onto people who already have a home and are getting a second home. And I think that, as great as that would be for someone who's chosen that lifestyle, that's a real problem for our renters.
Yeah, it's not the cause of the problem, though.
No.
And I've always been a big advocate that someone who puts their head down and invests in themselves, their own education, works hard, earns a living, pays heaps of taxes, that they've earned the right to spend their money on whatever they want. Money.
Yeah.
If someone's got 2 homes or 22 homes, they haven't been gifted those. If they've made smarter decisions and sacrifices and been more disciplined or worked harder or whatever, good on them. We shouldn't be knocking those people down. In fact, what we should be doing, instead of penalising, we should be tapping in to their intellect and trying to learn from them and using them as role models. It doesn't mean that everyone needs or wants 2 homes, but the fact that they've done it more than once, they can teach those who haven't done it. It's attitudes that's the biggest problem, Cate. And look, those who seriously think that for every investor who sells a home, there's this big queue of wannabe first home buyers. And that's just rubbish. We have had, I'm a facts and figures person, as you know, and the last 3 years, Australia has had an all-time record high. Never in our history have we had more people become first home buyers in the last 3 years. We've had a declining population.
Yep.
So it's not that people can't acquire a home. There's never been a bigger collection of policies supporting first home buyers than now. Never been, right? You can, for as small as a 2% deposit for some people, you can become a first home buyer. You've got different state government initiatives in regards to stamp duty support and all that sort of stuff. So now and always, if you genuinely want to become a first home buyer, you will become a first home buyer. It's got nothing to do with, that person, I want to become a first home buyer. I've got the resources to become a first home buyer, but I can only buy one property. And that property is owned by Cate and she's an investor. I can't buy anything else. I can only buy the one that the investor's in. So can someone do something to force that investor to sell the property? Because that's the only one that I want to buy. I mean, fucking stupid, right? Where do these people get off?
It is. It's mindless. It's ridiculous. And I agree with you. We've had some good initiatives for first home buyers, and anyone can have a look at the ABS data and have a look at refinancing activity versus owner occupier versus first home buyer. It's all there for people to see. They can look at the stats, and first home buyers have ticked up. There's no doubt about it. I did want to ask you, I've got lots of questions for you. Victoria and Queensland, there's something there, unfortunately, we share in common when we have a look at what the government proposed in Queensland in 2022. It was repealed, but it did a lot of damage. Just the murmur of it and the fact that people feared it would actually roll out. We saw a few changes in Queensland. Can you chat about that?
Yeah, so it's about this time last year, actually. I think it was August last year. It did actually get passed. So there's a piece of policy that was not discussed with any sector of the community. It was just the Queensland government behind closed doors saying, same as the Victoria situation this week, saying we've got so much debt, we've got to raise revenue. No one likes taxes because what is revenue for a government? It's tax. So no one likes new taxes. Basically, the decisions are made based on what's going to give us the less heat. If we're going to bring in a new tax, okay, let's always pick on the property investors. Property investors and miners are always the two that get targeted when any government wants to bring in a new tax, right? So they decided to, and they passed new legislation without any consultation that said that anyone who owns a property for investment purposes in Queensland, we are going to calculate land tax based on the land component in Queensland and in every other state in Australia. So you could be a Queensland resident, a Victorian resident, doesn't matter. If you own one or more properties, investment properties in Queensland, they're going to calculate land tax based on the combined sum of land right across Australia.
Yep.
So you might have one investment property in Queensland and one in New South Wales, for example. They're going to add the total land component together and tax you on that. That got passed with a date of implementation of about 12 months down the track. And then fortunately, lots of people, jacked up, and Victorian government, so the Queensland government could see that they'll probably get turfed out of government if they didn't repeal that. So thankfully it was repealed, but it is a sign of the times of where governments' heads are at. That they have created so much debt and they have to pay it back. Like we all do. When we borrow money, we have to pay it back. But when a government has to pay something back, they've got to raise more revenue. It just means more taxes. And they clearly do not care that passing new taxes against those who provide rental accommodation is clearly not a good idea, because that means that there'll be investors somewhere who'll sell because of that new decision, which then the knock-on effect of that is a tenant will be turfed out of a home and there'll be no rise to live. So they're actually not helping anybody. If they've got to raise more revenue, they've got to raise more revenue.
Yeah.
But they need to leave they need to leave alone rental providers, because there's never been a time when Australia needs more rental providers than right now.
And on that note, dare I say it, you've already said the F-bomb, so it can't get any worse. Rent caps.
Yeah.
I'm worried about this.
Been discussed in most states at a state level.
Yeah.
And the Greens are the ones behind that. To date, they've been unsuccessful in each state getting the incumbent state government to put a freeze on caps.
Yeah.
But now we're in a situation where I think probably for the first time in Australia's history, Kate, 7 out of 8 states and territories are under the reign of the same government. In this case, it's Labor, and Labor are also the federal government. So that there's increasing power there now that the Greens have to blackmail Labor into putting a federal freeze on rents. Now, God help us, with the stuff that's already happened over the last 8 years, and already, investors have thrown the toys out of the cot and said, we don't want to participate in this anymore.
Yeah.
If they put a freeze on rents, or in any way restricted income of investors, I don't know if I want to be living in this country, to be honest, because I have grave fears that if that happens, that would be the absolute boiling point that will create significant civil unrest, potentially result in violence.
It's dire.
That's not Australia,
really dire.
Is it? That is not Australia.
Not the Australia we've grown up in, that we know and love. Not at all. I think that the unintended consequences will be an absolute mess. I'm very fearful. If we look at it practically and we take away the social component, and we look at property investment as a way to grow your wealth or to look after yourself in retirement, which is the reason I went into property investment, Simon. I didn't do it to get rich. I did it so that I wasn't on the pension. I did it so that I could enjoy my retirement. I could look after my grandchildren. I could be that generous grandparent. My grandparents worked hard. They had a business. They had their money in shares. They weren't loaded by any means, but they were able to be generous with us, and it was beautiful. That's what a lot of people want out of property investing. And I think to threaten that, or to put people in a position where they're looking at their decision to go into property, they haven't done it for altruistic reasons. Most people don't. I like the fact that I provide shelter, but I'm not providing shelter for free because of an altruistic move. I'm doing it because that's the asset class I chose, and it's the one I know and I'm good at it. So if I'm forced into a corner, if we were to have rent caps, then it's not viable for me. I'd just be, I would then have to make that decision. Is this now an altruistic decision, or am I not going to throw away money and have this negative cash flow for nothing? I would make the decision to sell and go into shares. And that's just a sensible, pragmatic decision, because I'm not getting land tax on shares. I'm not getting rental eviction moratoriums on shares. In fact, I think our government particularly wants us all to be in shares by the looks of things. But that's what a lot of investors will do, and it will be a mess. The social implications, I don't even want to think about it.
Yeah. And there are people that will hear your story. They go, great, Kate, that's exactly what we want you to do. Put your money into shares so that then all of a sudden we can buy your property.
Great.
Back to my F-bomb earlier.
Yes.
If there's people out there who legitimately had done all the right things and made the right decisions and had saved their deposit and had a stable job and were credit worthy, they would own a home now, Kate.
Yes. Yep. If you tick all of those boxes and you want a property in this nation, there's a vehicle for you.
At the end of the day, a property investor is a role model of society. And I mean, if you have a think about what are they doing, they're exercising financial discipline, they're goal setters, and they're people who aspire to be independent. Are they not things we want to teach our children?
Absolutely.
Surely they are things. Yeah, aim high, Johnny. Don't be relying on others, Johnny. Don't be that person who always puts his hands out expecting things from others. Set goals. Be disciplined. Be courageous. Be prepared to cop the occasional bit of scar tissue. Learn from that.
Yeah.
Don't be defeated by that. Move forward. That's what our leaders in business do. That's what the elite athlete does. And their financial leaders are the whether it's property or share investors, the people who choose investing to discretionary action. They are role models.
Yeah.
We should be applauding those people and using them to encourage others to follow those good traits. What we've done in this country for most of the last 230 years is encourage that. For whatever reason, from 2015 onwards, we've become this world of socialism and entitlements and victim mentalities and tall poppy syndrome.
Yeah.
The person who shows those good character traits in that role model, now we just line them up day after day with a baseball bat and just keep going whack, 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 whack. And how is that going to be helpful? That's not going to create a better Australia.
Not at all.
We'll end up in a worse place.
We chatted just before we went to air, Simon, about the costs that landlords are enduring to hold their asset. And when I say enduring, I don't want it to sound like it's painful. I've always held negative cash flow with pride because there's been a greater goal. The greater goal is by the time I get to retirement, I won't be on the corporate treadmill or having to work at this rate, and I won't have debt left over. That's the goal. And I've engineered mine that way through a mix of rental, balanced rental properties, not just high capital growth performers, but everyone's strategy is different. The end goal though is that you get a little bit of financial freedom and you've got the choice in retirement. So that doesn't come, it doesn't land in your hands on a silver platter. It comes with sacrifice. And I think back to, I'm 50 next year, and I started in property when I was 21. And I remember all of the times I didn't go out having a particular dinner with friends or couldn't go away on a holiday because I had cash flows to be responsible for. And I did without, particularly in the early decade, to make sure that I stayed on track with my goals. And even now, you and I talked about the cost of living that we hear is biting low-income earners and renters. It's biting everyone. We're all gripped by this and impacted by it. But you had some figures, and I thought I'll throw that back to you.
Yeah, I mean, the cost of living, yes, it's real, but it's also exaggerated, and it's a lot. I think when I hear the way cost of living is used, it's people looking for sympathy. Yep. When or looking for handouts, when actually they've got some decisions that they could make themselves and review their own discretionary expenses. They're actually not doing it as tough as what they need to be if they're prepared to make some cuts. But the household expenses that go up, well, landlords have got households as well. They've got kids in school and groceries to buy and petrol to buy. I mean, it's not as if the landlord is immune to these expenses. Everyone's affected by them. But the commentary since interest rates started to rise about this time last year has all been centred towards, the poor tenant. We've got these cost of living pressures, which includes their rent. We've got to stop that, which is partly where the rent freeze commentary come from, right? Yeah. So that's just focusing on that segment of society with complete disregard to the person who's providing the roof over the head of that tenant that they say that they're claiming to protect. That the landlord's expenses have gone up by a heck of a lot more than the tenant's expenses. So here's some Victorian figures. What I've done, Kate, is for consistency here, I've captured the median house price of Melbourne and various other parts of regional Victoria and assumed that it was purchased by a rental supplier using a 10% deposit. at an interest rate of 5.5%, and assuming that rent is collected 48 weeks out of 52, to calculate an annual shortfall of income that the landlord needs to absorb on that property. This money has to come out of their pocket before Dan Andrews' increase to land tax yesterday.
Yep.
So Greater Melbourne, $30,000 per year. This is an after-tax figure.
Right.
So someone just Greater Melbourne buying a standard house, not a luxury home, with a 10% deposit today and putting a tenant in it, collecting the median rent, there will be a shortfall between that annual rental income and annual expenses of $30,000. If they bought an apartment, a standard apartment in Melbourne, it'll be a $19,000 shortfall. At different parts of regional Victoria. In Ballarat, it's an $18,000 shortfall. Same in Warragul, $15,000 in Bendigo. Different parts of Melbourne. Frankston, $25,000 for a basic house is the annual shortfall. $20,000 in Melton is the annual shortfall. Footscray, $31,000. Geelong, $22,000. And who is a landlord? Well, according to the ATO, these are official statistics, 92% of Australian property investors are not property moguls. They're not James Packer. They are everyday Aussies who own one or two investment properties. I'll say that again, 92% of rental suppliers in this country own one or two properties. 73% of those people have an annual income of $100,000 or less.
Yep. These
are not rich bastards.
Yep.
No wonder so many of them have sold their properties over the years. Whack, whack, whack with baseball bats, earning everyday incomes, the same sort of income that the aspiring so-called wannabe first home buyer is probably earning, but hasn't exercised the discipline and hasn't set the goals that the property investor has done. So if we want to talk about cost of living, and we think it's a good idea whether you're a federal government, state government, Liberal, Labor or bloody Greens, the existing suppliers of rental accommodation are forking out already $20,000 of their own money to cover a shortfall, on top of the groceries and every other bullshit cost of living thing that people want to talk about. So if you think it's a good idea to add another expense to that, like Dan Andrews' land tax, that'll hit Victorian investors by $1,000 to $2,000 extra per year,
yep,
and then potentially another couple of interest rate increases, tell me how any of this is going to help the situation. It won't. Yep. So we need to be encouraging these people. If we genuinely want to improve the situation, the rental situation in this country, we need to have a look at the decisions we've made over the last 8 years, because that's caused this mess. Review each one of those decisions, and there is the answer to getting back to where we were. Because you know what, Kate, for 220 years in this country, we had more than enough rental accommodation.
Yep, it's sobering, really sobering. Great stats.
We've had declining population, so we should have surplus rental supply. We've got the opposite. So this is not a COVID creation. This is not an interest rate creation. This is not an overseas migration creation. This is a red tape poor policy creation, demonising property investors. Support them.
So well said. Simon, I could talk to you more, but it's depressing. And I say that respectfully. Reba have crafted a press release and we'll be, no doubt, getting some interviews out there, which I think is really important. We've got an industry body that is not impressed by any of this, and it will impact a lot of our clients that we've been helping create their own wealth journey in all shapes and sizes. And as you've said, thinking about those stats that you mentioned, that's a representation of a lot of my clients. You know, they're lovely people that are having a go at this for the first time. And I get a couple of investors that might have a second go or a third go, fewer and far between, but they're normal everyday Aussies. They're lovely, and that hurts, knowing that they're facing headwinds that they shouldn't be facing. I want to quote you on one of the lines that you shared in the press release, which I thought was powerful. Any logical person can see the order of the day demands that those with the capacity to add rental supply should be encouraged. The country needs them. Instead, politicians everywhere are punishing them. It's nonsensical. I absolutely agree.
Thank you. If I can leave on a positive note,
please.
Any existing property investor or otherwise aspiring property investor listening to this, we feel your pain, we feel your anger, we feel your frustration, but you've already shown the traits to be disciplined, to be a goal setter, to be a positive person, to be someone who enjoys independence. Don't allow those with bad attitudes to suppress that. You are a role model. Continue to be a role model.
Nicely said, Simon. Thank you. I love my time with you, and I respect your words of wisdom. And yeah, I hope things get better. I hope they see the light. I'm not optimistic, but it's nice being aligned with someone I regard so highly. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on.